In the farthest reaches of the galaxy, where stars burned like embers in a dark void, there was a planet unlike any other. It was called Virath 7, a death world. Its skies were painted with storms that never ceased, its jungles teemed with creatures too dangerous to name, and its people were forged by the harshest conditions imaginable. Survival here wasn't just a way of life, it was the only way of life. Kale Vosk moved silently through the dense undergrowth, his sharp eyes scanning every shadow. He was tall and lean, his body hardened by years of hunting on this unforgiving world. His skin bore scars from countless battles, some against predators, others against rival tribes. But none had broken him. Not yet. Today, he stalked a beast known as the Razor Claw, a six-legged predator with claws sharp enough to slice through steel. It would make fine prey if he could bring it down. The forest around him buzzed with danger. Strange vines coiled like snakes, ready to lash out at anything that came too close. Above, flocks of feathered scavengers circled, their cries piercing the air. Kale paid them no mind. He had faced worse than this. But then something happened that stopped him dead in his tracks. A low rumble echoed across the land. Not the growl of thunder or the roar of some unseen monster, but something deeper, stranger. It felt as though the ground itself was groaning in pain. Kale froze, his hand instinctively reaching for the plasma bow slung over his shoulder. The sound grew louder, vibrating through his chest, until it became unbearable. Then, without warning, the sky split open. Above the treetops, a jagged wound appeared in the heavens. It shimmered with colors Cal couldn't describe, shades of purple, gold, and black swirling together like liquid fire. Beams of light shot out from the tear, illuminating the jungle below. For a moment, everything seemed frozen. The wind stopped blowing. The animals fell silent, and even the storm clouds above paused their endless dance. What is this? Kale whispered to himself, squinting up at the anomaly. His heart raced, not out of fear, but out of curiosity. This was new. This was different. And on a planet like Virath 7, anything new meant trouble. As he stood there staring, the tear pulsed again, sending waves of energy rippling outward. The trees shuddered violently, shedding leaves and branches, as though they were being shaken by an invisible hand. A flock of birds exploded into the air, screeching wildly. Even the Razor Claw, which had been lurking nearby, bolted in terror, abandoning its territory. Kale tightened his grip on his bow, scanning the area for signs of danger. Whatever this thing was, it didn't belong here. That much was clear. Yet, despite the chaos unfolding around him, he felt an odd pull toward the tear. It was as if it were calling to him, whispering secrets only he could hear. For a long moment, Kale debated turning back. The wise choice would be to return to his tribe's stronghold and warn them about what he'd seen. But something held him in place. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was recklessness. Or maybe, deep down, he sensed that this event was bigger than him, bigger than Virath 7, and that ignoring it wasn't an option. Taking a deep breath, Kale stepped forward, his boots crunching softly against the damp earth. "If this thing wants me," he muttered under his breath, "it'll have to deal with what I bring." And with that, he began making his way toward the tear, unaware that the fate of the universe now rested in his hands. Kale moved cautiously through the jungle, his senses on high alert. The tear in the sky loomed larger with each step he took, its unearthly glow casting strange shadows across the forest floor. The air felt heavier now, charged with an energy that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. He had seen many strange things on Virath 7, creatures born from radiation storms, plants that devoured their prey alive. But this was different. This wasn't just dangerous. It felt wrong. As he neared the stronghold of his tribe, the sounds of panic reached him before he saw anything. Shouts echoed through the trees, mingling with the howls of frightened animals. When Kale finally broke into the clearing where the stronghold stood, he found chaos. People ran in all directions, some carrying weapons, others clutching children or supplies. Fires burned in scattered patches, and the usual order of the camp was gone. "What's happening?" Kale demanded, grabbing the arm of a young hunter named Rin as she hurried past. "It's the sky." Rin gasped, pointing upward. "It won't stop shaking." "And the whispers. They're everywhere." Kale frowned. "Whispers?" Before she could answer, a low hum filled the air, growing louder with each passing second. It wasn't like any sound Kale had ever heard. It vibrated deep within his bones, making it hard to think clearly. Then came the voices. They weren't loud, but they were unmistakable. Faint murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The words were jumbled, spoken in languages Kale didn't understand. Yet somehow they carried meaning. Pain, loss, desperation. Everyone's hearing them, Rin said, her voice trembling. Even the elders don't know what to do. Kale scanned the crowd, spotting Elder Torin standing near the central fire pit. The old man leaned heavily on his staff, his usually calm face lined with worry. Kale pushed his way through the throng of people until he reached him. "Elder," Kale said, his tone urgent. "What is this? What's causing it?" Torin looked up at him, his eyes clouded with unease. "The spirits are restless," he said slowly. "They cry out for balance. Something has disturbed the natural order, not just of our world, but of everything." Kale shook his head. "Spirits? You mean those whispers? That's nonsense. There's something real behind this. I saw it. The tear in the sky." Torin's expression darkened. "You've been near it." "Yes," Kale admitted. "And I'm going back. If there's a reason for this madness, I'll find it." "You're mad," one of the other hunters shouted. "That thing will kill you." But Kale ignored them. He turned to leave, only to feel a hand grab his shoulder. It was Lyra, a woman who had once been part of the tribe, but was exiled years ago for her experiments with forbidden technology. She had returned during the commotion, her sharp green eyes fixed on Kale. "I've seen anomalies like this before," she said quietly. "Whatever it is, it's not natural. And if you go alone, you won't survive." "I don't need your help," Kale snapped, shrugging off her grip. Lyra smirked. "Maybe not, but you'll wish you did when you're staring down whatever's waiting for you out there." Her confidence intrigued him, even though he hated to admit it. Still, Kale refused to let anyone slow him down. "Stay out of my way," he warned, turning toward the edge of the camp. As he walked away, the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to follow him, wrapping around his mind like tendrils of smoke. For a brief moment, he thought he caught a glimpse of something, a figure standing among the trees, watching him. But when he blinked, it was gone. Whatever awaited him beyond the jungle, Kale knew one thing for certain. Answers lay ahead, and whether they brought salvation or destruction, he intended to find them. Kale pushed deeper into the jungle, his every step deliberate and measured. The whispers followed him like a shadow, growing louder with each passing moment. They weren't just in his ears now. They seemed to echo inside his head, pulling at the edges of his thoughts. He clenched his jaw, trying to block them out, but they refused to fade. Instead, they began to form shapes, blurry images that flickered across his vision like ghosts. The jungle itself felt different here, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The usual cacophony of animal calls had vanished, replaced by an eerie silence. Even the plants looked strange. Their leaves shimmered faintly, pulsing in time with the hum from the tear above. Kale tightened his grip on his plasma bow, ready for whatever might emerge. And then he saw them. At first, they were little more than glimmers of light dancing between the trees. But as Kale moved closer, the lights coalesced into figures, tall, translucent beings made of fractured light and sound. Their forms shifted constantly, never settling into one shape for long. Some had elongated limbs that stretched impossibly far, while others floated inches above the ground, leaving trails of glowing particles in their wake. Kale stopped in his tracks, his instincts screaming at him to run. Yet something about these creatures kept him rooted to the spot. They radiated no hostility, only an overwhelming sense of sadness. Their presence filled the air with a weight that pressed down on Cal's chest, making it hard to breathe. One of the beings drifted closer, its form stabilizing slightly. It reached toward him, not with hands, but with tendrils of light that seemed to pulse with energy. Cal instinctively raised his bow, aiming it squarely at the creature's core. "Stay back," he growled, his voice steady despite the unease twisting in his gut. The being froze, tilting its head as though studying him. Then, without warning, it spoke, not with words but directly into his mind. The voice was soft, layered with countless others, like a chorus singing a mournful tune. "You are aware," it said. "You hear us." Cal lowered his bow slightly, his brow furrowing. "Who are you? What do you want?" "We are the Luminae," the being replied. "Remnants of civilizations lost to the void. We cry out for balance, for restoration. Your world is key." "My world?" Cal asked, confusion mixing with suspicion. "What does this have to do with Virath 7? The Luminae's form shimmered, and suddenly Cal was bombarded with visions, images of collapsing stars, burning planets, and entire galaxies dissolving into nothingness. He saw civilizations reduced to ash, their people screaming as reality unraveled around them. And through it all, he felt the pain of the universe itself, a deep, unending sorrow that threatened to crush him. "This tear is a wound in existence," the Luminae explained, "caused by those who sought power beyond understanding. If left unchecked, it will consume all." Cal staggered back, overwhelmed by what he'd seen. "Why tell me? I'm just a hunter. I don't understand any of this." "You are more than you know," the Luminae responded. "Your kind has survived where others would perish. You are strong, adaptable. That strength may yet save us all." Before Cal could respond, the forest erupted in chaos. A low growl rumbled through the trees, followed by the crash of something massive moving toward them. The Luminae recoiled, their forms flickering wildly. "They come," one of them whispered urgently. "They seek to claim the tear for themselves." "Who?" Cal demanded, spinning around to face the direction of the noise. "Those who caused this calamity," the Luminae said grimly. "They must not succeed." With that, the beings vanished, leaving Cal alone once more. Moments later, a group of armored figures emerged from the shadows, their weapons glowing with unnatural energy. They wore helmets that obscured their faces, and their movements were precise, mechanical. Cal raised his bow again, his heart pounding. These newcomers were clearly not friendly. As they advanced, he realized he had two choices: fight or flee. Either way, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't let them take control of the tier. The battle lines had been drawn. Whatever happened next, Cal understood that his life, and perhaps the fate of the universe, depended on what he did in the moments to come. The armored figures moved with cold efficiency, their glowing weapons humming ominously as they surrounded Cal. He stood his ground, his plasma bow aimed at the nearest soldier, though he knew he was outnumbered. The forest around him seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the first strike. "Leave," Cal growled, his voice cutting through the tense silence. "This isn't your place." One of the soldiers stepped forward, raising a hand in a gesture that might have been meant to calm, but instead felt like mockery. From behind their helmet, a distorted voice crackled. "We are here to correct an imbalance. Step aside, primitive." Cal's grip tightened on his bow. Primitive. They had no idea who, or what, they were dealing with. Without hesitation, he fired. A bolt of blue energy shot from his weapon, striking the leader squarely in the chest. The impact sent the figure stumbling back, but it didn't fall. Instead, its armor flared with light, absorbing the blow. Persistent, the soldier muttered before signaling to the others. In an instant, they charged. Kale dove to the side as beams of energy sliced through the air where he'd been standing. He rolled to his feet and fired again, this time targeting one of the weaker-looking soldiers. The bolt hit true, shattering part of their helmet and sending them sprawling to the ground. But there were too many of them. For every one he took down, two more pressed forward. Just when it seemed like he wouldn't last another minute, something unexpected happened. The Luminae reappeared, their forms flickering erratically as they interposed themselves between Kale and the attackers. One of the beings unleashed a wave of radiant energy, forcing the soldiers to retreat momentarily. "You must endure," the Luminae said urgently, their voices overlapping in Cal's mind. "But first, you must prove yourself worthy." Before Cal could ask what they meant, the world around him shifted. The jungle dissolved into darkness, replaced by a vast, surreal landscape. Towering cliffs of obsidian rose on all sides, and rivers of molten gold snaked across the ground. Above, the sky churned with storms of shimmering light. It was beautiful and terrifying. "This is the trial of strength," the Luminae announced. "Survive, and we will grant you power. Fail, and all is lost." Kale barely had time to process their words before the first challenge appeared. A massive beast emerged from the shadows, a creature unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its body was covered in jagged plates of bone, and its eyes burned with fury. It roared, shaking the very ground beneath Cal's feet. Hefting his plasma bow, Cal prepared to fight. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about proving he deserved the Luminae's trust. With a roar of his own, he charged. The battle was brutal. The beast was faster and stronger than any predator on Virath 7, its movements unpredictable. Every time Kale landed a hit, it retaliated with devastating force. His arms ached, his legs burned, and sweat poured down his face, but he refused to give up. Using every ounce of skill and cunning he possessed, he dodged, struck, and adapted until finally, with a well-placed shot to its glowing core, the beast collapsed. Before he could catch his breath, the scene changed again. Now he stood in a labyrinth of shifting walls made of crystal. Strange symbols glowed along the pathways, pulsing faintly as if alive. A voice echoed around him. "Solve the puzzle, or be trapped forever." Kale studied the symbols carefully, recognizing patterns that reminded him of ancient carvings he'd seen in his tribe's sacred caves. Slowly, he began piecing together the sequence. Each correct choice caused the walls to shift, opening new paths. Mistakes, however, triggered traps, spikes erupting from the floor, bursts of searing light. By the time he reached the center of the maze, his body was battered, but his resolve was unshaken. At the heart of the labyrinth, a single pedestal awaited him. On it rested a glowing orb. As Kale reached out to touch it, visions flooded his mind. Memories of failures, fears, and losses. He saw himself failing his tribe, losing loved ones, being consumed by darkness. But he also saw moments of triumph, courage, and hope. Clenching his fists, he forced himself to face these truths head-on. When the visions faded, the Luminae materialized before him once more. "You have faced fear," they said, "and you have endured." Kale nodded, breathing heavily. "What now?" "There is one final trial," the Luminae replied. "It will test not just your strength, but your spirit. Are you ready?" Kale straightened, determination blazing in his eyes. Do your worst. Whatever lay ahead, he knew he couldn't afford to fail, not when so much was at stake. Kale emerged from the trials battered but triumphant, his body coursing with newfound energy. The Luminae had kept their word, granting him abilities he could barely comprehend. His senses were sharper, his reflexes faster, and a faint glow now emanated from his skin, a reminder of the power they'd infused into him. But there was no time to marvel at these changes. As soon as he stepped back into the jungle, reality crashed down on him like a tidal wave. The armored figures, the ones who called themselves correctors, were still out there, scouring Virath 7 for the tier. Worse yet, word of Cal's encounter with the Luminae had spread among the tribes. Some saw him as a savior, a chosen warrior destined to protect their world. Others viewed him with suspicion, fearing that his new powers made him dangerous. And then there were those who envied him. Chief among them was Thalric, a ruthless warlord from a rival tribe. Known for his cunning and ambition, Thalric ruled through fear and brute force. When news reached him about the tear in the sky, and Cal's connection to it, he saw an opportunity. If the tear truly held immense power, it could be weaponized to crush his enemies and expand his dominion over Virath 7. All he needed was control of the anomaly, and Cal out of the way. Thalric's spies tracked Cal's movements, reporting every step back to their leader. By the time Cal returned to his tribe's stronghold, Thalric's forces were already waiting. They launched a surprise attack under cover of night, their advanced weapons cutting through the defenses of Cal's people with brutal efficiency. Chaos erupted as fires lit up the camp, screams piercing the darkness. Cal fought fiercely, wielding both his plasma bow and his newfound strength. He moved like a storm, striking down attackers with precision and speed. But even he couldn't hold off an entire army alone. Just as things looked dire, reinforcements arrived. Unexpected help from Lyra, the exiled scientist. She appeared at the edge of the battle, leading a small team armed with makeshift gadgets and explosives. "Need a hand?" she shouted, tossing Cal a device that emitted a blinding flash of light, momentarily stunning Thalric's soldiers. "What are you doing here?" Cal demanded, catching the device midair. "Saving your life, apparently," Lyra shot back, firing a projectile that sent 2 attackers flying. "You didn't think I'd let you face this alone, did you?" Together, they turned the tide of the battle. With Lyra's ingenuity and Cal's raw power, they managed to drive Thalric's forces back, for now. But the victory came at a cost. The stronghold lay in ruins, many lives lost, and Thalric himself had escaped, vowing revenge. As the dust settled, Cal turned to Lyra, his expression conflicted. "Why did you come back? You don't owe us anything." Lyra crossed her arms, her green eyes narrowing slightly. "Maybe not. But if what you told me about the Luminate is true, then this isn't just your fight. It's everyone's. Besides," she added with a smirk, "you're going to need someone smarter than you if we're going to stop Thalric." Despite himself, Cal couldn't suppress a faint smile. For all her arrogance, Lyra had proven herself trustworthy and useful. Still, he knew their alliance wouldn't be easy. Her methods clashed with his instincts, and her motivations remained unclear. Yet for now, they shared a common goal: stopping Thalric before he could exploit the tier. Over the next few days, Cal and Lyra worked together to fortify what remained of the stronghold while gathering allies from other tribes. Not everyone trusted them. Some feared Cal's growing power, while others distrusted Lyra's past experiments, but enough joined their cause to form a fragile coalition. Meanwhile, Thalric regrouped, plotting his next move. He knew Cal was strong, but he also knew strength alone wasn't enough. With superior technology and sheer ruthlessness, Thalric intended to take what he wanted and destroy anyone who stood in his way. As tensions mounted, Cal realized this conflict would test more than just his strength. It would challenge his leadership, his trust in others, and his ability to unite a fractured people against a common enemy. The stakes were higher than ever, and failure meant not only the destruction of Virath 7, but the unraveling of the universe itself. Yet, standing beside Lyra, and looking out at the determined faces of his newfound allies, Cal felt a spark of hope. Together, they might just have a chance. The coalition Cal had gathered was fragile, a patchwork of tribes and outcasts united by necessity rather than trust. Each group brought something to the table: hunters skilled in tracking, warriors hardened by battle, and even scavengers who knew how to salvage valuable resources from the ruins of old tech. But tensions simmered beneath the surface, and Lyra's presence only added fuel to the fire. Many distrusted her motives, whispering about her experiments and questioning whether she truly cared about their survival or merely sought personal gain. Despite the unease, Kale pushed forward. Time was running out. Thalric's forces were growing stronger, and the tear in the sky pulsed with increasing intensity. If they didn't act soon, it would be too late. With Lyra's guidance, Kale devised a plan to infiltrate the heart of the tear itself, a chaotic realm where reality bent and broke. It was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it was their only chance to stabilize the anomaly before Thalric could exploit it. Lyra explained what lay ahead as they prepared for the journey. "The core of the tear isn't just a place," she said, pacing back and forth in front of the assembled group. "It's a dimension of pure energy, constantly shifting and unstable. Gravity doesn't work the way you expect, time flows differently, and everything you see might not actually exist." Kale frowned, his arms crossed over his chest. "Sounds like another Deathworld." Lyra smirked. "Exactly. Except this one doesn't play by any rules you know." As they ventured closer to the tear, the landscape around them began to change. Trees twisted into impossible shapes, rivers flowed upward into the sky, and shadows moved on their own, detaching from their sources. The air crackled with electricity, making every step feel heavier, more deliberate. Even Kale, whose body now thrummed with power from the Luminae, felt the strain. When they finally reached the threshold of the tear, the world dissolved completely. One moment, they stood on solid ground. The next, they were adrift in a kaleidoscope of light and sound. Colors swirled around them, forming abstract shapes that shifted unpredictably. The ground, if it could even be called that, was made of fragmented pieces of terrain floating in midair, connected by invisible paths. "This is insane," muttered one of the hunters, clutching his weapon tightly as he stared at the disorienting expanse. "Stay focused," Kale ordered, his voice firm despite the chaos surrounding them. "We don't have time to panic." Lyra activated a handheld device she'd built specifically for this mission. It emitted a low hum, projecting a grid-like pattern into the air. "This should help us navigate," she explained. "But we'll need to move quickly. The readings are already spiking." Their progress was slow and treacherous. At one point, they encountered creatures born from the tear's instability, twisted amalgamations of light and shadow that attacked without warning. Kale fought them off with bursts of radiant energy, his movements precise and calculated. Lyra used her gadgets to disable others, deploying EMP charges and reflective shields to protect the group. But the true challenge came when they reached the core of the tear. There they found a massive sphere of pulsating energy, its surface rippling like liquid gold. Surrounding it were constructs, hostile entities formed entirely of fractured data, each one more aggressive than the last. "We need to get inside," Lyra shouted over the deafening roar of the core. "That's where we can stabilize it." "How?" Kale demanded, dodging an attack from one of the constructs. "I'll create an opening," Lyra replied, pulling out a small canister filled with glowing liquid. "But I'll need cover." Without hesitation, Kale charged forward, unleashing waves of energy to hold off the constructs while Lyra worked. His body screamed in protest, the strain of channeling so much power threatening to overwhelm him. Yet he refused to falter, knowing failure wasn't an option. Finally, Lyra succeeded. A gap opened in the core's defenses, revealing a swirling vortex within. As she stepped toward it, however, her expression darkened. "There's something else here," she murmured, hesitating. "What is it?" Kale asked, his voice tense. Before she could answer, a voice echoed through the chamber. Not the whispers of the Luminae, but something colder, darker. "You cannot undo what has been done." A figure emerged from the vortex, cloaked in darkness. Its eyes burned with malice, and its presence radiated pure hatred. Thalric had beaten them to the core. "You're too late," Thalric sneered, raising a hand glowing with stolen energy. The universe will bow to my will. Kale tightened his grip on his bow, his jaw clenched. Not while I'm still breathing. The final confrontation had begun. The chamber pulsed with energy, the core of the tear radiating waves of light and shadow that distorted everything around it. Kale stood at the edge of the vortex, his body tense and glowing faintly from the luminaise power coursing through him. Across from him, Thalric loomed like a dark specter, his armor now fused with fragments of stolen energy from the tear. His eyes burned with an unnatural intensity, reflecting both ambition and madness. "You think your little rebellion will stop me?" Thalric sneered, lifting a hand crackling with raw power. "I am the future, the one who will reshape this broken universe into something better." Kale didn't flinch. "Better for who? You're tearing apart reality itself." Thalric laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed through the chaotic void. "Reality is weak. It needs to be remade by someone strong enough to wield its power, someone like me." Lyra stepped forward, clutching her device tightly. "He's using corrupted energy from the tear," she warned Kel under her breath. "If he activates whatever weapon he's building, it'll widen the tear exponentially. We won't just lose Virath 7. We'll lose everything." Kale nodded grimly. There was no room for hesitation now. This wasn't just about stopping Thalric. It was about saving the universe itself. With a roar, Thalric launched the first attack, a bolt of jagged black energy that tore through the air toward Kale. Instinctively, Kale raised his plasma bow, deflecting the blast with a shield of radiant light. The impact sent shockwaves rippling outward, nearly knocking Lyra off her feet. "Stay back," Kale shouted over the chaos. "This is my fight." But Lyra ignored him, her mind racing as she analyzed the situation. She knew brute force alone wouldn't be enough to defeat Thalric, not while he was channeling the tear's unstable energy. If they wanted to win, they'd need to outsmart him. While Kel engaged Thalric in a brutal exchange of blows, Lyra worked frantically on her device. Her hands trembled as she adjusted settings, rerouting power sources, and recalibrating frequencies. Sweat dripped down her face, but she refused to give up. This was their only chance. Thalric swung wildly, each strike laced with destructive energy that shattered chunks of floating terrain around them. Kale dodged and countered, his movements fueled by desperation and determination. Despite his enhanced abilities, he could feel himself weakening. Every collision drained him further, and the strain of wielding so much power was taking its toll. His vision blurred, and his limbs burned with exhaustion. "You can't win," Thalric taunted, landing a heavy blow that sent Kale sprawling across the fractured ground. "You're nothing compared to me." Kale gritted his teeth, struggling to rise. His body screamed in protest, but he forced himself to stand. "Maybe I'm not as strong as you," he admitted, his voice steady despite his condition. "But I got something you'll never understand, something worth fighting for." Before Thalric could respond, Lyra activated her device. A high-pitched whine filled the chamber as beams of concentrated energy shot out, targeting the corrupted nodes embedded in Thalric's armor. Sparks erupted, and Thalric stumbled back, momentarily stunned. "What have you done?" he roared, clawing at the damaged sections of his suit. "It's over, Thalric," Lyra yelled, stepping closer. "Your connection to the tear is severed." Enraged, Thalric lunged at her, but Kale intercepted him, tackling him to the ground. The two men grappled fiercely, their struggle shaking the very fabric of the unstable realm. As they fought, Kale noticed something, a faint glow emanating from the core behind them. It was pulsing erratically, growing brighter with each passing second. The tear's destabilizing. Lyra cried out, panic creeping into her voice. "We need to stabilize it now, or it'll collapse completely." Kale hesitated, torn between finishing Thalric and preventing catastrophe. In that moment of indecision, Thalric seized the opportunity, throwing Kale aside and scrambling toward the core. He reached into his belt, pulling out a small device, a fail-safe designed to widen the tear beyond repair. "No," Kale shouted, launching himself at Thaurik once more. They collided violently, grappling for control of the device. The pulsing light grew blinding, threatening to consume them all. And then, Kale made a decision. Summoning every ounce of strength left in him, he channeled all available energy into himself. Energy from the Lumine, the tear, and even his own life force. His body ignited with radiant light, brighter than anything either of them had ever seen. "Let go," Kale commanded, his voice echoing with authority. Thaurik tried to resist, but the overwhelming surge of energy overwhelmed him. The failsafe shattered in his hand, and the core began to stabilize. But at a cost. Kale collapsed to his knees, his body trembling as the energy drained away. Lyra rushed to his side, tears streaming down her face. "Kale, what did you do?" "I bought us time," he whispered hoarsely, managing a weak smile. "Now finish it." As Lyra worked to seal the tear, Kale leaned back, gazing at the swirling colors around them. For the first time in days, he felt peace, even if it might be fleeting. As Lyra worked feverishly to stabilize the tear, Kale lay on the ground, his body racked with pain. The surge of energy he'd channeled had saved them from Thaurik's doomsday device, but it had come at a steep price. His vision blurred, and every breath felt like fire in his lungs. Yet despite his condition, there was clarity in his mind. He had done what needed to be done. Now it was up to Lyra. "Hurry," Kale rasped, his voice barely audible over the hum of collapsing energy around them. "We don't have much time." Lyra didn't respond. Her hands moved frantically over her device, adjusting settings and rerouting power flows. Sweat dripped from her brow as she concentrated, her green eyes wide with determination. She knew that failure wasn't an option, not when the fate of the universe hung in the balance. The core of the tear continued to pulse erratically, its light flickering between blinding brilliance and ominous darkness. Fragments of terrain floated around them, breaking apart and dissolving into nothingness. The entire realm groaned under the strain, threatening to collapse at any moment. "I'm almost there," Lyra shouted, her voice strained but resolute. "Just hold on." Kale clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay conscious. He could feel the Lumine's presence lingering within him, a faint warmth that seemed to whisper encouragement. It was as if they were urging him to endure, to see this through to the end. Summoning the last reserves of his strength, he pushed himself up onto one knee, using his plasma bow as a makeshift crutch. Thaurik was gone, or so it seemed. His broken form had vanished during the chaos, swallowed by the tear's instability. Whether he was dead or merely defeated remained unclear, but Kale couldn't afford to dwell on it. There were bigger threats to worry about now. With a final burst of effort, Lyra activated her device. A beam of pure white light shot out, piercing the core of the tear. For a moment, everything froze. The pulsing stopped, the swirling colors stilled, and an eerie silence fell over the chamber. Then, slowly, the tear began to shrink. "It's working," Lyra exclaimed, relief washing over her face. The energy flow is reversing. But their victory was short-lived. As the tear contracted, the surrounding realm started to destabilize even further. Gravity shifted unpredictably, pulling them in different directions. Floating chunks of terrain crashed into each other, sending shockwaves rippling outward. The very fabric of reality seemed to unravel before their eyes. "We need to get out of here," Kale yelled, staggering to his feet. "Now." Lyra hesitated, glancing back at her device. "I can't leave it. If I disconnect it prematurely, the tear might reopen." Kale grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong despite his weakened state. "Then we take it with us. Hold on tight." Before Lyra could protest, Kale wrapped an arm around her waist and leaped toward the nearest fragment of stable ground. Using his newfound abilities, he propelled them through the chaotic void, dodging falling debris and bursts of energy. Each step took immense effort, But Kale refused to let go. Behind them, the tear continued to collapse, shrinking until it was little more than a pinprick of light. But the process released a massive shockwave, shaking the entire realm violently. Kale shielded Lyra with his body as they tumbled through space, landing hard on a jagged piece of floating terrain. When the tremors finally subsided, they found themselves back at the threshold of the tear, its once massive wound reduced to a faint scar in the sky. Exhausted, Kale collapsed onto his back, staring up at the fading anomaly. His body was spent, his muscles trembling uncontrollably, but he managed a weak smile. "You did it," he whispered, turning his head toward Lyra. She knelt beside him, tears streaming down her face. "No," she said softly. "We did it." For a moment, they simply sat there, catching their breath and taking in the enormity of what they'd accomplished. The universe was safe, for now, but Kale knew their journey wasn't over. The scars left behind would need healing, both on Virath 7 and across the cosmos. And though he felt hollow, drained of the power that had once surged through him, he also felt something else: hope. As the last traces of the tear disappeared, the Luminae appeared one final time, their forms shimmering faintly. They bowed low before Kale, their voices soft but filled with gratitude. "You have given us peace," they said. "May your strength guide you forward." And then they were gone, leaving Kale and Lyra alone beneath the stars. The aftermath of the tear's collapse left Virath 7 in a fragile state. The once unstable anomaly had vanished, but its effects lingered like scars on the planet's surface, and within its people. Rivers that had flowed upward now surged chaotically, flooding lowlands and carving new paths through the jungle. Strange mutations began appearing among wildlife, evidence of residual energy seeping into the ecosystem. For many, life felt uncertain, as though the ground beneath their feet might crumble at any moment. Kale and Lyra returned to what remained of the Coalition's stronghold, weary but alive. Word of their victory spread quickly, carried by scouts and messengers who spoke of how Kale had faced down Thalric and sacrificed himself to save them all. Some hailed him as a hero, others whispered uneasily about the cost of his power. But no matter what they said, one truth was undeniable: things would never be the same. As Kale rested under the shade of a twisted tree, his body still recovering from the toll it had endured, Lyra approached him with a mixture of gratitude and guilt etched onto her face. She held out a small vial filled with glowing liquid, the last remnants of the Luminae's energy she had extracted during their escape. "This is for you," she said softly, placing it gently in his hands. "It's not much, but it might help you heal faster." Kale stared at the vial, his expression unreadable. "You didn't have to do this," he murmured. "After everything I've done, I'm not sure I deserve it." Lyra sat beside him, brushing strands of hair away from her face. "Deserve has nothing to do with it. You saved us all, Kale. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." Her words brought little comfort. Though the immediate threat was gone, Kale couldn't shake the weight of responsibility pressing down on him. He had seen glimpses of the universe's fragility, witnessed civilizations crumbling into nothingness, and while closing the tear had been a victory, he knew it wasn't enough. If humanity, or any species, continued down the path of greed and recklessness, another catastrophe was inevitable. "What happens now?" he asked after a long silence. "How do we stop this from happening again?" Lyra hesitated, her gaze drifting toward the horizon, where the scarred sky met jagged mountains. "We rebuild," she said finally, "but differently this time. No more shortcuts. No more playing God. We need sustainable technology, ways to harness energy without tearing apart reality." Kale nodded slowly, though doubt gnawed at him. Convincing others to abandon old habits wouldn't be easy, not when so many saw power as the ultimate goal. Yet deep down, he believed change was possible. After all, hadn't he changed? From a lone hunter driven only by survival to someone willing to risk everything for the greater good. Over the next few days, Kale threw himself into helping the tribes recover. He worked alongside hunters repairing damaged shelters, shared meals with families mourning lost loved ones, and even brokered uneasy truces between rival factions. His presence inspired hope, but it also drew suspicion. Some questioned whether his connection to the Luminae made him too dangerous to trust. Others feared the power he had wielded, and could potentially wield again. One evening, as Kale stood atop a cliff overlooking the jungle, Lyra joined him. In her hands, she carried blueprints for a new project, a research institute dedicated to studying sustainable energy and preventing future disasters. "I want you to lead it," she said bluntly, holding out the plans. "Your name carries weight. People will listen to you." Kale frowned, shaking his head. "I'm not a leader, Lyra. I'm just a survivor." "You're more than that," she countered firmly. "Whether you like it or not, people see you as a symbol, a protector. Use that influence to make a difference." For a moment, Kale said nothing, staring out at the stars twinkling faintly above. Then, with a resigned sigh, he took the blueprints from her hands. "All right," he said quietly, "but I won't do it alone." Lyra smiled, relief washing over her face. "Good, because we'll need everyone if we're going to fix this mess." As they turned back toward the camp, Kale felt a flicker of resolve reignite within him. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but he wasn't walking it alone. Together, they would restore balance, not just to Virath 7, but to the universe itself. And somewhere, far beyond the stars, the Luminae watched silently, their tears replaced by faint smiles of hope. Months passed, and life on Virath 7 slowly began to stabilize. The scars left by the tear were still visible, shattered landscapes, mutated creatures and rivers that flowed in strange patterns, but the planet's people adapted as they always had. Survival was their way of life, but now it came with a newfound sense of purpose. Kale stood at the forefront of this change, his name spoken with reverence by some and cautious respect by others. The research institute Lyra had envisioned became a reality, nestled in the heart of what remained of the Coalition's stronghold. Its walls were built from salvaged materials, twisted metal beams, reinforced stone, and glowing panels powered by sustainable energy sources. Inside, scientists and engineers worked tirelessly alongside hunters and warriors, blending ancient wisdom with modern ingenuity. It was here that Kale spent most of his days, guiding projects aimed at preventing another cosmic catastrophe. Though he never sought leadership, Kale embraced the role thrust upon him. He walked among the tribes, listening to their concerns and sharing stories of the Luminae and the lessons he'd learned during his journey. His words carried weight not because of fear or force, but because of authenticity. People saw in him a man who had faced unimaginable challenges and emerged stronger, not for himself, but for them. Lyra, too, found her place within the Institute. Her experiments no longer focused on forbidden technologies or shortcuts. Instead, she dedicated herself to understanding the delicate balance between progress and responsibility. Together, she and Kale formed an unlikely partnership, one rooted in mutual respect and shared determination. But peace didn't come without its challenges. Falric's fate remained unknown, his broken form swallowed by the collapsing tear. Rumors circulated that he had survived, retreating into hiding to rebuild his forces. Others claimed he had merged with the chaotic energies of the void, becoming something far more dangerous. Regardless of the truth, Kale knew better than to let his guard down. Vigilance was key. One evening, as the sun dipped below the jagged horizon, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, Kale climbed to the top of a nearby mountain. It was a place he often visited when he needed clarity, a vantage point where the vastness of the universe stretched out before him like an endless canvas. The air was cool against his skin, and the stars twinkled faintly above, each one a reminder of how fragile existence truly was. Lyra joined him after a while, carrying 2 steaming cups of tea made from herbs native to the jungle. She handed one to Kale, sitting beside him in comfortable silence. "You've done well," she said after a moment, her voice soft but sincere. "People look up to you now." Cale sipped the tea, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "It's not about me. It's about what comes next. If we don't learn from our mistakes, all of this will have been for nothing." Lyra nodded thoughtfully. "Do you think we can really make a difference?" "We have to try," Cale replied firmly. "That's all anyone can do." As they sat there under the starlit sky, Cale felt a quiet sense of fulfillment. He wasn't the same man who had once roamed the jungles alone, driven solely by survival. He had become something greater, a protector, a teacher, a symbol of hope. And though the road ahead would undoubtedly be fraught with challenges, he faced it with unwavering resolve. Somewhere beyond the stars, the Luminae watched silently, their whispers replaced by faint smiles of approval. They had chosen wisely. Cal Vosk, the hunter from a death world, had risen to meet the call, and in doing so, had ensured that the universe would endure. And as long as there were those willing to fight for balance, the light of hope would continue to shine.